episode proves that sometimes the most powerful thing in politics is where you draw the line. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, the podcast where we go way past the headlines and into the legislative weeds, so you don't have to. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Stephen. And today we've got a story that somehow manages to be about procedure, politics, constitutional law, and also the future control of the US House.
So, light stuff, really. Really easy listening. Nothing controversial at all.
No, as usual. Not a bit controversial. Just a statewide referendum that could ripple all the way to Washington.
Ah, yes, these statewide referendums that we've been seeing in the last year that can ripple all the way to Washington, especially for the midterms coming up here in November.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, this one, less about gerrymandering. We haven't got sort of salamanders here. It's more about lobsters. So I don't know how that'd be called. What would that be called? Jerry lobstering?
It's, gerstering. Gerstering? That sounds a little bit more better.
Doesn't quite work. It's still just as crazy. So, I mean, we've spoken about this before, but let's just remind everybody how weird, deeply, deeply weird it is that in the United States, you allowed the legislators to design their own districts. So rather than having the voters selecting their politicians, you have the politicians selecting their voters. It's nuts, and nobody else does it that way. The interesting, constitutional reasons why that is the case, but it's still crazy and it still needs to change.
Yes, it is really crazy. And I think this is something that is particularly timely to talk about because I've been seeing a lot of discourse online of people just being so confused why nobody's worried about their seat and they're just going up for their seat and it's no big deal, especially people who are in the House. And it's because these districts are so far leaning one direction or the other, and it does lean both directions. Gerrymandering happens on both sides, and there are people who are very secure in their seats on both sides. But it is really interesting because when you look at people who are maybe getting a little on the mature side, and you want to get some people who are maybe some young blood, and there's this huge contentious fight in these districts because there really isn't. Because it's gerrymandered so much to one area and people are really fighting for change. But because of the way the area is, the candidates, how people are aware of politicians, and that means not that much. Most of us are not incredibly super tuned in. Yeah. So,
I mean, there's maybe a slightly more positive way to look at it if we can try and look at it from the other direction. So what you can say is, this is a bit of a reach, but work with me. So campaign financing in the United States is so broken, so ridiculously broken, that basically politicians spend all of their time trying to raise money so that they can actually fight the next election rather than actually doing their jobs. And that then, of course, as we know, means you have all this dark money pouring in. You have politicians who are basically in the hock to big business and all that kind of stuff. So if you have a safe district, then clearly, you don't need to worry too much about that. So maybe the politicians can actually spend less time raising money and less time worrying about the next election and more time actually doing their jobs. The problem with that argument is that that's not the way it works, because then instead of having a competitive election, then what you end up having is competitive primaries instead. So instead of politicians putting all their time and effort into focusing on an election, which is actually fairly reasonable in a democracy, instead they spend all their time focusing on the primary and actually fighting against their own people. And the primary process itself tends to pull people to the extremes of the left and the right. If you're not careful, and if these primaries get really nasty, then you end up not selecting the best candidate to actually represent the interests of the people of that constituency, or in fact to beat your opponent in the final election. So you end up with this weird sort of twisted, distorted view of politics. I mean, what's really needed in America is joint reform. One, campaign financing reform, and secondly, getting rid of gerrymandering. If you could do those two things, it would transform the American political system. You would get that new blood in, and politicians wouldn't have to spend all their time raising money.
Also, I feel like if we had some term limits in there, that might help some things.
Term limits could work. I mean, there are pros and cons to term limits. One of the problems you have is this dead duck idea, like a president in their second term, certainly in the second half of the second term, they can't do anything. So you've got like effectively 25% of the time they're president when they're pretty ineffective. And so term limits can do that. But I think given how sort of geriatric the American political system has become, maybe that is needed. Maybe you do need to say an age limit of some kind. You're not allowed to be, a legislator if you're over 80. I don't know. maybe even
I
earlier
think
than
there's
that.
some things that could be explored there, maybe some cognitive
Yeah,
tests.
absolutely. You have to ace your tests.
Yes, ace all those tests. I mean, I also think that it is a little different with like a lame duck representative versus a president because you're just an individual in a movement when you're a representative. You're not the head honcho kind of situation. And so I think that,
Yeah,
I
would
mean,
be
it
less.
doesn't matter because it doesn't exist. But I do think if we had term
Yeah.
limits, we would actually see the last 25% of people's time be when they're putting the most forward for their ideas and their work, which is hopefully what they were
Legacy.
elected for. So that's in my little dream world how I think that'll go.
Yeah, that's true.
It's
It's true
not
because
the world we
you
live
do
in.
see that with presidents as well. Though they can be fairly unleashed in their second term, and particularly towards the end of the second term, because they know they don't have to win any more elections. So they say, right, well, I'm
Right.
just going to do what needs to be done without
Right.
worrying about whether it's popular or not.
Right.
Sometimes you can do
But
some quite staggering stuff.
well, and the concerns there is we would definitely want to make sure those cognitive tests are intact if they were doing
Yeah.
that. Okay, so let's get into things. Today
Yes.
we're talking about Virginia's upcoming April 21st vote tied to HJR, House Joint Resolution 4, a measure that on paper sounds very procedural, but in reality could reshape congressional power. And a quick plug here before we dive in, if you want to follow legislation like this in real time across all 50 states and Congress, Bill Track 50 is your best friend here. You can find HJR 4, HB 29, which we'll talk about in a second, and every twist in this story without doing the battle on a state website.
Yes, yes. And trust me, for something like this, you want the level of detail that Bill Track 50 provides.
Absolutely. And those state websites get really overwhelming. So, anyways, Stephen, let's start simple. What exactly is happening in Virginia right now?
So, Virginia is about to vote on whether to temporarily change its constitution to allow mid-decade redistricting of congressional maps. And that's really unusual. As we've spoken about before, normally congressional maps are drawn once every 10 years after the census. And Virginia actually reinforced that idea in 2020 when voters approved a constitutional amendment back then, handing redistricting to a bipartisan commission.
Right. So voters said, hey, legislature, maybe you shouldn't be drawing your own districts.
I know, what a wild idea. Maybe legislators shouldn't be drawing their own districts because it's a bit like a kid at school writing their own tests, isn't it? Let's say, what exactly do you want to be tested on? They're going to make it pretty easy, aren't they? And that's what the elections tend to be. So Virginia then, just a few years later, the legislature is coming back to the electorate and saying, okay, so we know just a few years ago you said, let's make it all, bipartisan and stuff. But what if we really need to, just this once, go back to gerrymandering?
Okay, so let's get into the legislative core here. So I'm very interested to see their approach because HRJ4 is not the map itself, it's the mechanism. So walk us through what that looks like.
Yes. So as always, we love a bit of legislative shenanigans. So the key point here, this joint resolution HGR4 is what's called a second reference constitutional amendment. In Virginia, that means it's the second amendment of two that need to pass in two different sessions and then go to voters for final approval. So this is a mechanism they have to say, okay, you basically have to do it twice to make absolutely certain that this is really what the legislature wants. So it's sort of adding these hurdles in to make constitutional amendments a little bit more tricky. So it was the second one, as I say, it was enacted last time as well. And this was finally sort of signed and enacted on March the 30th year. So it's full steam ahead for this vote.
All right.
And what HJR4 does is carve out a temporary exception to the current redistricting rules. Specifically, it allows the General Assembly to redraw congressional districts before 2031, but only under certain conditions. And these are absolutely crucial here. So the two conditions that must be met: another state must redraw its map outside the normal cycle, so tick, and that the redrawing isn't court ordered. So obviously that would be a very different thing. So also tick in this circumstances. So those two conditions have been met. And if they are met, Virginia can then respond by redrawing its own district through October the 31st, 2030.
Okay, so this seems a little bit like a mutually assured destruction democracy, also break glass in case of partisan emergency clause.
Yes, absolutely. And that's how supporters do frame it. It's an emergency escape hatch.
Okay, but the real action here is in some other legislation, House Bill 29, right?
Yes, that's right. And this is where things get very, very concrete because House Bill 29 is the actual congressional map. And that's already passed the legislature and has already been signed by the governor as well. So it's ready to go. But, and this is very crucial, it only takes effect if voters approve the HJR4 constitutional amendment.
Okay, so HJR4 equals permission. House Bill 29 is the actual redraw. So voters aren't just deciding on process, they're indirectly deciding on whether this specific map goes into effect.
Yes, exactly. And when you look at the numbers, the stakes become very clear. So let's have a look at Virginia's current congressional delegation. So you have 6 Democrats, you have 5 Republicans, which is, broadly speaking, reflective of the partisan split across the state. So fair enough. Under the proposed map, however, Democrats, if the election goes their way, could have the advantage in 10 of 11 districts.
Okay, that is not subtle.
No, not even a little. This isn't just a tweak, it is transformational. It's really indicative of the fact that the maps weren't gerrymandered before. They were quite fair. And so as soon as you start gerrymandering, you can do all sorts of stuff, as the Democrats have done here, to really skew it in their favor.
Okay, so let's dig into that a bit because this is where redistricting gets both fascinating and honestly slightly surreal.
Yes. And the geography tells the story. So, under the proposed map, the 5th district shifts from a South Side Charlottesville mix to something heavily centered around Richmond. The 6th district combined areas like Roanoke, Charlottesville, and Lynchburg into a new coalition seat. The 7th district, which is interestingly nicknamed the Lobster District, stretches across rural Virginia but draws most of its population from northern Virginia.
Okay, and the Lobster District sounds like something you'd order, not vote in. And this kind of very interesting map is actually where gerrymandering came from because the very first map that was done in this way looked like a salamander and it was done by a man named Gerrymander. So that's why at the top what were we in? We were in gerstering now.
Gesturing, yes, or lobster mandering or something. Yeah. Yes. So it illustrates a serious point there. These districts aren't just lines on a map. They determine which communities are grouped together and whose voices actually carry weight.
And sometimes those communities are connected by shared interest and sometimes by shared voting patterns. This isn't happening in a vacuum, though. Why is Virginia even considering this now?
Well, that's because of what's happening nationwide. So there is a growing mid-decade redistricting movement, really, which is sparked largely by Donald Trump telling states to do it. And obviously Texas took up that banner first, and they redrew their maps to give them a huge partisan advantage. And since then, like we mentioned at the top, multiple states have already redrawn their maps for 2026, with California as the big Democratic one, largely offsetting the Texas map. And there is a lot of other states that are actively considering it as well. So Virginia lawmakers are effectively saying, if everyone else is doing this, then we can't afford not to. It's this defensive argument again.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like, Texas did it, then California's was in response, and what California did was only to very specifically offset Texas, and then we see the language here that's, if it's done somewhere else, then we can break glass, and it's like, okay, well, who is Virginia offsetting, and can we draw those direct correlations there? So, all right, so, honestly, this just seems like legislature peer pressure, but with congressional seats. So let's talk about the messaging battle here. It is incredibly fascinating.
Yes, it is. And the two arguments, the sort of the campaign literature and stuff that goes out there. If you're in Virginia, I'm sure you'll be very familiar with all of this now. That it's two different universes, not even two different worlds in terms of how they describe what's going on here. So it really comes down to two words, both fairness and, of course, gerrymandering. So supporters of this argue, and in fact, the wording of the Constitutional Amendment itself states that this would restore fairness, which is an odd argument to use when you are moving from a fair map to what most people, I think, would agree is completely unfair to give Democrats this massive advantage in Congress, even though that's not the sort of the percentage of the vote they get. So they do say it restores fairness. I think they're looking on a more national level. And it protects Virginia from being disadvantaged, and it is temporary. It does have to be approved by voters, which You could argue in other states, particularly in the Republican states, that's not the case. Opponents, though, argue that this is textbook gerrymandering. It's overriding the will of the people. It's overriding that 2020 reform that voters have already approved. And of course, opponents who are largely Republicans are having a sort of selective amnesia and not worrying too much about what's going on in other Republican states, because obviously those arguments could be used just as equally in other states, such as Texas. Now, the Supreme Court of Virginia has allowed this vote to proceed, even though there are sort of legal challenges underway, but it said that the underlying legal questions can be resolved afterwards. So even if the voters approve HDR4, the amendment could still face legal hurdles, and this map's implementation could be delayed or further challenged.
Okay, so voters are being asked to approve something that might still end up in court.
Yes, absolutely. So a rare case where the legal process is running alongside the democratic process. So, of course, if this constitutional amendment fails, then all the legal challenges stop. But if it succeeds, then they will push forward.
Okay, so let's talk strategy here, because this may come down to turnout.
Yes, as a lot of elections do. And this is where things get really unpredictable. Because remember, this is just a random vote in the middle of April. It's off season. People may not be aware of it. So it's very, very difficult to predict what the turnout will be like. But polling shows that voters generally like the idea of the reform, but they also do like the current system as well. And they aren't always consistent when both of those two ideas collide. And meanwhile, while the supporters of the amendment have a massive fundraising advantage, early turnout data does suggest that Republican-leaning areas are showing up more. And that's what you'd understand, really, because obviously the Republican-leaning areas are the ones that they're effectively going to be disenfranchised, because while they're majority Republican, they're going to end up with Democratic representatives in most cases there. So you can understand they'd be quite angry. So just as in California, they're likely to turn out more. The question is, though, are the Democrats also going to turn out and actually push this over the line?
All right, so that kind of seems like this is a nightmare scenario where the measure really relies on high Democratic turnout. We don't know if that's going to happen. So let's zoom out. What is this vote really about?
Well, officially, it's about whether Virginia should temporarily allow mid-decade redistricting in response to other states. But politically, of course, as always with these things, it's about something much bigger. So should a state that embraced independent redistricting pause that system for strategic reasons? Is this self-defense or opportunism? And then, of course, there's the political nature. Obviously, there's an enormous backlash against some of the stuff that President Trump has been doing. So is this going to be a referendum on Trump's leadership or the Republican Party more generally? It's really hard to say. So it's an interesting fight. It could really go either way.
Okay, so put differently, is this a shield or just a better designed sword?
Yes, absolutely. And, of course, it depends which way politically you lean as to what you might think.
Okay, Stephen, give us the bottom line here.
Okay, so if voters approve HGR4, HB 29 goes into effect. Virginia gets a new congressional map through 2030. The balance of power in the House could shift, but if voters reject it, or in fact it then later gets kicked out through legal challenges, the current map stays, the independent commission process remains untouched, and we'll see what happens in the midterms.
Okay, so either way, this is a perfect example of why tracking state-level legislation really matters.
Absolutely. Something that starts as a procedural resolution, HDR4, can end up reshaping national politics.
And that's exactly why we use tools like Bill Track 50 here and why they exist. Whether you are trying to track constitutional amendments, redistricting fights, or just trying to understand what your state legislature is up to, it's all there. And if you live in Virginia, get out and vote on April 21st. Whichever way you decide to vote yes or no, get out and do it. Make your voice count. That is why we are living in this democracy. And that is all for today's episode. So if you enjoyed this deep dive,
or if you now have strong opinions about lobster-shaped districts,
we've done our job.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll be back next time with another piece of legislation that matters more than it first appears.
Until then, stay informed. Maybe keep an eye out on Virginia and on these types of movements in other states. And don't forget to like and subscribe.